If you are struggling to find the perfect setup for your pull-up or chin-up, or find out which grip width is the perfect for you, this video is for you. If we take a look at the big street lifting PRs of our time, almost all of them are done with a pretty wide grip. Let's take a look at why the wide grip is, at least in theory, superior to more narrow grips. There are three main reasons why a wide grip in theory is superior. The first one is that we have, if we're gripping wide, less range of motion to pull up. Second reason is, if we take a look at the side view and we're gripping pretty wide, we have less bar distance, so also the horizontal distance to the bar is a bit less. That means the first two reasons are about cutting range of motion during the pull path. And reason number three is more a biomechanical reason. If we take a look at the muscles that can exert force in the starting position, the right grip offers a few advantages, as the lat has leverage to perform shoulder adduction in the starting position of a wider grip, whereas if we're having a more narrow grip and need to pull in extension, there is barely leverage for the lat to pull in that starting position. So the lift off for wider grips is a bit more powerful if we're pulling in that adduction scapular plane. Next to that, also the chest offers a bit more leverage and power in the starting position if we pull with wider grips. So the lift off tends to be more powerful if we're gripping wider. So if the wide grip is so superior, why is it that the more narrow grip and also the chin up feel so much more powerful and more comfortable for a lot of athletes out there? And the answer for this is your individual body shape. If you are an athlete who does the pull-ups or the chin-ups with a more narrow grip, and then you tried a wider grip or maybe switch from a chin-up to a pull-up, you probably experienced this at least once in your training career. So you're now doing your wider grip pull-ups and the lift-off actually feels pretty good, and you pull higher, and especially on higher intensities, you're then hitting a wall mid-range of motion and you cannot seem to produce any meaningful force anymore. So easy pull and then boom, hitting a wall, and the only thing that happens is that the shoulder tends to shrug up and the elbows are moving backwards. And if you didn't know, now you know that we are offering calisthenics and weighted calisthenics online coaching. So if you are interested in learning impressive bodyweight skills like planches, handstand push-ups, front levers, or attending a weighted calisthenics competition, then you should definitely schedule your free consulting call for our online coaching, and then we will help you to make sustainable gains, get rid of your discomforts, learn the movement patterns correct, and just progress with a lot of fun. So I hope to see you in the consulting call soon. And to explain why the closing part of wider grip pull-ups or chin-ups feels so much harder for some athletes than for others, requires a bit of biomechanical background knowledge, which we're going to cover now. The first thing we want to understand is that if there are muscles acting on the rib cage, that those muscles have the potential to change the shape of the rib cage. As you can feel, if you're breathing in and out, the rib cage has the ability to expand and compress in all of the different directions. So there is quite a lot of shape change happening during exercises and during breathing in your rib cage. If we're performing vertical pulling and we're performing it in the plane where the elbows are more next to the body, so from the scapula to the frontal plane, if we're moving in this spectrum, then the compressive forces, especially from the chest and from the lats, they will compress our rib cage anterior to posterior. So it gets flattened in this direction as we're having forces pulling it to the side. So for our notes, the moment we start to pull with the elbows more next to the body, we are increasing the anterior to posterior compressive forces on our rib cage. The next thing that we need to understand is that for the human body, in order to produce locomotion, we need to be able to move from external to internal rotation and from internal to external rotation. And the moment we're producing force, we want to be able to move from a relatively external rotated position into an internal rotated position when we want to, as I said, produce or accept forces. A perfect example would be your throwing. In order to throw a ball, you come from an external rotated position, so you need that external rotation range in order to produce force from internal rotation. If you don't have access to external rotation, you cannot produce force with the muscles contracting into internal rotation. Same if you're landing, your muscles need to accept the force and move from an external rotation standpoint to an internal rotation. And the same also happens in dips, in squats, in pull-ups, and all the other movements that we're doing in weighted calisthenics. So now why are we talking so much about having access to external and internal rotation when we actually want to take a look at what the superior pulling method is for us? And the reason for that is that with different shapes of our rib cage, we get different amount of access from external to internal rotation that will change the way that we need to grip in order to be able to produce more or less compressive forces on our rib cage. So how does the shape of the rib cage determine how much access we have from external to internal rotation? To explain that, we take a look at the position of the scapula on the rib cage. It's screwed on here, so I cannot move it, but you can see that in its resting position, it is angled. So with the shape of the rib cage, the scapula kind of has a fit on it. So with this more round barrel shaped rib cage here, the scapula is more angled. It is more internal rotated. So this medial border moves more to this side here of the rib cage. If we're now putting some compressive forces on the rib cage because we're pulling heavy with the elbows next to the body and the chest and lats, they're compressing the rib cage. Without doing any changes in our arm position, just by the movement of the ribs becoming more compressed here, what happens is that this shoulder blade, as it sits on the ribs, will move into external rotation with the shape of the rib cage. So we're compressing here, and that means the scapula automatically rotates with this border away from the rib cage, like that. Now it gets a bit tricky. If the scapula changes its rotated position on the rib cage with the shape of the rib cage, that of course influences also the rotation of our upper arm as it sits on the shoulder blade. So if we are in a pull-up position here, and as I said, in order to produce force, we want to gain access to internal rotation. But now, due to the compressive forces, the shoulder blade moves into external rotation and then puts our upper arm in a position of already relative internal rotation. Because there's two sides of the medal. We can move the upper arm into internal rotation, or we can move the scapula into external rotation. The relative positions are the same then. So moving the scapula in external rotation will put our upper arm into internal rotation. And that is, at a certain point in pulling, a real problem, because if the scapula puts the upper arm already in the end range of internal rotation, we have no access to it anymore. That means we cannot produce more force, and we are already at the end range. And in order to then gain more access to range of motion, we will start to shrug up the shoulder. This will put our elbow into a more horizontal position, and we cannot really pull up anymore. We can pull maybe a bit forward, but we cannot really exert force anymore in the desired position. So the shape of the rib cage will determine the position of the scapula. The position of the scapula will determine the position of our upper arm in the shoulder and will determine how much access we have to internal rotation on our way up. And if the shape of the rib cage limits the access to internal rotation, then we are limited in our ability to pull up. And if you're experiencing this so that you're running out of range and you cannot seem to pull more, even if it's a weight that you on a narrow grip or in a chin-up could move easily, then it's probably because due to the compressive forces, you're running out of range of motion and you cannot produce any more force. And this is nor good nor bad, it's just how it is. And now your individual shape comes into consideration, because if you take a look at different athletes, you will see from their natural shape that they have different types of rib cages. We will have athletes with a pretty flat rib cage, and we will have athletes with a pretty round rib cage. And the more flat your rib cage natural is, the earlier you will run out of range of motion if you're experiencing additional compressive forces, because you can't just accept less compressive forces until your shoulder blade puts your upper arm in that end range of internal rotation where you cannot produce any more force. So it's basically the shape of your rib cage that has, next to some other factors, a big influence on the grip width during a pull-up that feels good and strong for you. So by default, the shape of your rib cage can help you to understand if you are stronger with wider grips or if you're stronger with more narrow grips. And what I want you to do is take a look at your ISA, the so-called infrasternal angle. That's just the angle the two lower ribs meet on your sternum. So this angle here. And there we can give it some numbers so that you can understand if you have rather a wider shape or rather a more narrow shape. And the wider the shape is, the higher the chance that you can benefit from more narrow grips. And the more narrow your shape is, the higher the probability is that wider grips feel stronger for you. And as a rule of thumb, you can consider yourself wide if this angle here is 100 degrees or more, and you can consider yourself more narrow if it's more 90 degrees or lower. And if you are in between, then there's a lot of trial and error for you to do. As I said in the beginning of the video, how wide you grip determines if it's more likely that you go pronated or that you go supinated. If we take a look at very wide grips, there's only a few athletes having access to that supination in order to make a wide grip chin up feel good. If you have it, that can work fantastic for you, but it's rarely the case. So probably for wider grips, the pronated one just feels much more naturally and stronger. Same thing when we're moving closer. If we're gripping pronated on a very close grip, our own forearms will block the movement. So we have two options. We can flare the elbows out, which will harm force production again, or we just supinate. So for narrow grips, supination feels much more natural and offers a greater bar distance for the closing as your own forearm is not in the way. It's maybe important to understand that the shape of your rib cage also will change over your training career. So with more body weight and more muscle mass and different types of sports, also the bony structure of your rib cage due to the compressive forces of the muscles will adapt. So maybe in your earlier days you were more of a narrow structure, and over your training career you become a bit of a wider structure. And that's just a natural process that happens over several years, and then you can just adapt your training style towards that body shape. Another disclaimer at this part, the shape of the rib cage is one thing that we can consider. It will give us a very good indication if we should go for a more wide or more narrow grip, and it also explains why a more narrow or wide grip feels very good for once and very bad for others, or very weak for others. But it's not the only determinant. So there will be cases for individual athletes that have a pretty wide structure and still are stronger with chin-ups. And this can be something about training history. If you have a lot of training with a certain movement, even though you're maybe not genetically postponed to it anymore, it can still be stronger because you're so good at this movement and you practice it so much. It could also be internal leverages and muscle structures that due to how maybe your lats are built, adduction is the stronger movement for you versus shoulder extension, as it biases different regions of the lats. And so there can be different reasons why certain pulling patterns feel stronger for you, and the ribcage is just one indication, but it's a pretty accurate one. And from my experience, also with coaching a lot of clients, it gives you a very, very good starting point to test new grip variations from. Final summary: if you are a wide ISA. So if you have a wide ribcage structure, then I would recommend you to start with a narrow grip chin up. And when we're talking about narrow grips, we're talking about inside of our shoulder width. So that would be that or closer than that. If you are around 90, 100 degrees, somewhere in between, then you need to test a bit. You probably benefit from this medium wide grip, and then you can see if pull up or chin up feels stronger or more comfortable for you, also depending how much supination you have available in the elbow. So for those medium wide structures, medium wide grip can be a very good starting point. And if you have a more narrow structure, so 90 degree or lower, then there's a very high chance that you can benefit from wider grips, so more outside of shoulder width, like that, maybe 1.5 shoulder width. And that usually is done best with a pronated grip. But if you are a lucky one and you have access to a lot of supination without discomfort, also a wide grip chin up can work and be very powerful for you.